My son-in-law laughed at my old rusty pickup truck in front of the entire family, right there in my daughter's driveway, calling it an embarrassment before he climbed into his shiny lease sedan. He had no idea I owned the $10 million shopping mall where he walked in 3 days later, resume in hand, hopping to land a management position he desperately needed. I built that trucks rust 1 mile at a time, hauling equipment across 3 states before most people in that driveway were even born. Every dent tells a story about a deal closed, a property secured, a risk that paid off because I never once let appearances decide what I was worth. My son-in-law saw an old man driving an ugly truck and decided that was the whole picture. He never once asked what was parked behind that truck at my actual properties, or what sat in the bank accounts tied to a name he never bothered researching before he married into this family. He walked into my leasing office that Thursday afternoon, straightened his tie, and shook hands with a general manager who reports directly to me, applying for a job inside a building I built from an empty field 20 years earlier. He had no idea whose office sat on the top floor. He had no idea whose signature would eventually decide whether he got hired at all. What happened over the following weeks tested my daughter's marriage, exposed exactly what kind of man she chose to build a life with, and forced me to decide whether protecting my family meant staying quiet forever or finally letting the truth walk through that door behind him. Stick with me because this story does not end the way pride usually wants it to. Before we start, hit that like button, share this with someone who has ever been judged by what they drive instead of what they built, drop a comment when you get to the part that hits you, and subscribe so you catch the next one. My name is Walton Beckett, and I am 63 years old. I grew up in Amarillo, Texas, on a small cattle ranch my father leased rather than owned, working land that never truly belonged to us no matter how many years of sweat we poured into it. My father raised beef cattle for a rancher named Buford Ellis, splitting profits on a deal that always seemed to favor Buford whenever the numbers came out uneven. I learned early that a handshake deal, however fair it sounds on paper, only protects the man who actually holds the paper. Money stayed scarce my entire childhood. My mother canned vegetables from a small garden behind our house every single summer, rows of tomatoes and green beans that had to last us clear through winter. I wore boots 2 sizes too big some years, stuffed with newspaper at the toe, because new boots cost money my father did not have once he settled up with Buford at the end of each season. School clothes came from the church donation box most autumns, and I learned to stop caring what other kids thought of my hand-me-downs somewhere around age 9, mostly because caring never once put better clothes on my back. My father died when I was 15, a heart attack in the middle of a July afternoon while mending fence line in 100-degree heat. Buford Ellis showed up at the funeral, shook my mother's hand, and told her the lease on our house needed settling within 30 days since my father was the one who technically held the working arrangement. I remember standing there in a borrowed black suit jacket, watching a grown man deliver an eviction notice disguised as condolences, and something hardened in me that day that never fully softened again. My mother and I moved into a small rented apartment in town, and I dropped out of school the following year to work full-time, first at a feed store, then eventually hauling equipment for a regional construction outfit that paid better wages than anything else available to a 16-year-old boy without a diploma. I earned my GED at night 3 years later, the same way plenty of hardworking men before me have closed that particular gap, studying by lamp light after 12-hour shifts, because my mother refused to let me settle for less than finishing what I started. I bought my first truck at 19, a used Ford with 80,000 miles already on it, paid for in cash I had saved dollar by dollar for 2 full years. That truck became my whole world for the better part of a decade, hauling materials for every construction job I could find across the Texas Panhandle, learning the building trade from the ground up the same hard way I learned everything else in life. I met my wife, Dawn, at 22, working the counter at a diner where my crew stopped most mornings before sunrise. She had a steady, patient way about her that balanced my restless drive perfectly, and she never once flinched at the grease under my fingernails or the exhaustion in my eyes after a 16-hour shift. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony at her family's church, and we moved into a rented duplex on the edge of Amarillo that we could barely afford, furnished mostly with items other people had thrown away that I fixed up with my own 2 hands. Our daughter, Callista, was born 3 years into our marriage, and something about holding that little girl in a cramped, rented duplex lit a fire in me that had been quietly building since the day Buford Ellis handed my grieving mother an eviction notice at my father's funeral. I decided right then that no landlord, no lease, no man holding the paper was ever going to hold power over my own family's roof again. I was going to own something real, something nobody could take from us because we did not technically hold the deed. Nobody in that cramped duplex nursery, least of all me, could have guessed that decision would eventually build a $10 million shopping mall, or that decades later, my own daughter's husband would stand inside it applying for a job without the faintest idea whose signature actually controlled his future there. I started small, the only way a man with almost nothing ever really can. At 26, I used every dollar Dawn and I had saved, along with a modest loan our local bank reluctantly approved after 3 separate rejections, to buy a half-acre lot on the edge of Amarillo that nobody else wanted, a scrubby, forgotten piece of land sitting between a defunct gas station and a stretch of undeveloped highway frontage. I built a small strip of retail units on that lot myself, working alongside a crew of 2 men I could barely afford to pay, doing much of the physical labor personally after my regular construction shifts ended each day. Dawn kept the books at our kitchen table every single night, tracking every dollar in and out with a discipline that saved our fledgling development from collapsing more than once during those brutal early years. The first tenant, a small hardware store owner named Curtis Whitlow, signed a lease before I had even finished pouring the parking lot, taking a chance on an unproven landlord, because I offered him better terms than the established property owners downtown who saw a small independent hardware store as beneath their attention. That single leap of faith from Curtis kept our family afloat through some genuinely terrifying financial stretches over the following 2 years. I nearly lost everything during our 4th year in business, when a flash flood damaged 2 of the 4 retail units badly enough that insurance covered only a fraction of the repair costs, leaving me personally responsible for a repair bill that threatened to swallow every dollar of profit the property had generated since we opened. I remember sitting at our kitchen table with Dawn late one night, staring at numbers that simply did not add up no matter how many times we recalculated them, wondering if I had made a catastrophic mistake dragging my young family into a business I barely understood well enough to run. Dawn reached across that table and took my hand, the same steady patience she had shown me since our very first morning at that diner counter. "You've never once failed at anything you refused to quit on, Walton," she said. "This is just another wall. You've torn through worse ones with your bare hands before." I took out a second loan against the property itself, a terrifying risk that could have cost us the entire development if the repairs failed to attract enough new tenant interest to cover the increased debt payments. It worked barely, and by year 6, the small strip center had stabilized into steady, reliable income that let me start reinvesting profits into acquiring additional land nearby rather than simply paying down debt as fast as possible. By the time I turned 40, I had assembled nearly 15 acres of contiguous property on that same edge-of-town corridor, watching Amarillo's growth patterns carefully enough over the preceding decade to recognize that highway expansion plans would eventually turn my forgotten scrubland into some of the most valuable retail real estate in the entire region. I broke ground on what would eventually become Beckett Commons, a full enclosed shopping mall anchored by 2 department stores and dozens of smaller retail tenants, financed through a combination of my own accumulated capital, patient bank relationships I had built over 15 years of never once missing a loan payment, and a small group of local investors who trusted my judgment because they had watched me build something real from literally nothing. Beckett Commons opened when I was 44 years old, and within a decade it had grown into the anchor retail property for the entire eastern side of Amarillo, valued today at just over $10 million, generating steady income that allowed Dorn and I to live comfortably without ever needing to announce that comfort to anyone who was not already family. I never changed how I lived despite the growing wealth. I still drove work trucks instead of luxury vehicles, still wore practical clothes instead of anything flashy, still showed up personally to walk the mall property most mornings checking on maintenance issues, and chatting with longtime tenants like Curtis Whitlow, who still ran his hardware store, now relocated inside the mall itself, more than 3 decades after that first leap of faith. Callista grew up watching all of it, the brutal early struggles and the eventual stability both, though by the time she reached her teenage years, our family's comfortable position probably felt more permanent to her than it ever felt to Dorn and me, who remembered exactly how close we had come to losing everything more than once along the way. I never wanted Callista choosing partners based on money, mine or theirs, and I made a deliberate choice early in her adulthood to keep my true net worth private from almost everyone outside Dorn and my closest business associates, preferring people to judge our family based on character rather than a number they could research or assume. That choice, made with the best of intentions, eventually set the stage for a misunderstanding that would test my daughter's marriage in ways I never anticipated. Callista met Desmond Hargrove during her final year of college, a charming, ambitious young man studying business administration with dreams of climbing quickly through corporate management ranks. Desmond came from a modest background himself, raised by a single mother in Lubbock who worked 2 jobs most of his childhood, and I initially respected that shared understanding of hard beginnings when Callista first brought him home to meet us. They married 4 years later, in a modest ceremony Dorn, and I helped fund without ever revealing the true scale of resources actually available to us. I drove my usual work truck to that wedding, the same one I had been driving for the better part of a decade by then, rusted along the wheel wells and dented from years of hauling materials to job sites across the panhandle. Desmond made a small joke about it that day, nothing malicious, more curious than cruel, asking Callista quietly why her father drove something so beat up when the mall property clearly generated real money. "Dad's just frugal," Callista told him, and Desmond apparently accepted that explanation without pushing further, assuming, I think, that our family's wealth existed at a modest, comfortable level rather than anything approaching what Beckett Commons actually generated in annual income. Desmond's career took a difficult turn about 6 years into their marriage. He had climbed reasonably well through a regional retail management company, but a corporate restructuring eliminated his entire division without warning, leaving him unemployed at 34 with a mortgage, 2 young children, and a level of professional pride that made the job search that followed increasingly difficult for him emotionally. I offered to help during that stretch, gently, the way I always tried to offer support without overstepping boundaries Callista and Desmond had established as a couple. Desmond declined most direct financial help, insisting he needed to find his own way back onto solid ground rather than leaning on his father-in-law's resources. I respected that pride, even as Dorn, and I quietly worried watching the stress visibly wearing on both Callista and the grandchildren during increasingly tense family dinners. The comment that changed everything happened on an ordinary Sunday afternoon at a family gathering in Callista and Desmond's driveway, about 7 months into his unemployment. I had driven over in my old truck, the same rusted, dependable vehicle I had owned for over a decade, to help Desmond move some furniture Callista wanted rearranged in their garage. Desmond walked out to greet me, and instead of a handshake, he laughed, genuinely laughed, gesturing toward my truck in front of Callista, the grandchildren, and Dorn, who had arrived separately in her own car. "Walton, when are you finally going to retire that thing?" he said, loud enough for the whole driveway to hear, an edge of embarrassment creeping into his tone that suggested this was not the first time he had thought it, just the first time he had said it out loud. It's honestly kind of an embarrassment parked next to everyone else's cars at these family things. I get that you're frugal, but there's frugal and there's just this. The driveway went quiet for a moment. Callista's face flushed with obvious discomfort, caught between defending her father and not wanting to embarrass her struggling husband in front of the children. I did not respond with anger. I simply smiled, told him the truck still ran perfectly fine after all these years, and helped him move the furniture exactly as planned, letting the comment pass without confrontation, the same disciplined way I had learned to handle plenty of harder insults throughout my working life. But something in that moment settled uncomfortably in my chest, a familiar feeling I remembered from decades earlier, standing in a borrowed suit jacket at my father's funeral, while a man who held the paper decided what my grieving mother deserved. I said nothing that day. I simply drove home in my old truck, and I made a quiet decision that I did not share with anyone, not even Dorn, about exactly how I intended to handle whatever came next. 3 weeks later, my general manager at Beckett Commons, a longtime employee named Priya Chandrasekaran, who had worked alongside me for over 15 years, called to tell me a candidate named Desmond Hargrove had submitted an application for our open regional operations manager position, a role overseeing tenant relations and property management for the entire mall complex. I sat with that information for a long moment before deciding exactly how I wanted this particular story to unfold. I told Priya to proceed with the hearing process exactly as she normally would, treating Desmond's application with complete professional neutrality, evaluating his qualifications purely on merit without any knowledge of our family connection influencing the process one way or another. Priya, who had never met Desmond and had no reason to connect his last name to mine given how carefully I had always kept business dealings and family life separated, agreed without question. Desmond's qualifications, to his credit, were genuinely strong. His resume showed real management experience, and his interview performance, according to Priya's notes, demonstrated exactly the kind of steady, detail-oriented competence the position actually required. I felt a complicated mixture of pride and unease reading those notes, watching my son-in-law's genuine professional ability play out on paper completely separate from the pride and insecurity that had led him to mock my truck in front of our entire family. The interview process moved through 3 rounds over the following month, Desmond advancing each time on legitimate merit, never once suspecting the property he hoped to manage belonged entirely to the father-in-law he considered too frugal to matter much beyond family gatherings. I made a point of staying away from the leasing office during his scheduled interview times, unwilling to risk an accidental encounter before I had decided exactly how and when the truth should finally surface. Callista called me during that same stretch, her voice tight with a mixture of hope and worry. I recognized instantly as a daughter watching her husband's fragile confidence hang on an outcome he badly needed. "Dad, Desmond's interviewing for a management position at some big shopping center," she said, clearly unaware of exactly which shopping center she was describing. "He seems really excited about it. It would mean so much to him right now, getting back to work somewhere he actually respects." I told her I hoped it worked out well for him, careful to keep my own voice neutral despite already knowing exactly which property she meant. Something in me still hoped, genuinely, that this situation might resolve itself gently, that Desmond's own merit might simply earn him the position honestly, and that the truth about ownership could surface later calmly, on my own terms rather than through some dramatic confrontation. The final interview round arrived, and Priya called me that same evening with her formal recommendation, genuinely impressed with Desmond's candidacy and ready to extend a formal offer pending my final sign-off as majority owner, a routine step required for any position above a certain salary threshold within our management structure. I asked Priya to schedule the final offer meeting personally, requesting, for the first time in the entire process, that I attend that particular meeting myself, explaining only that I wanted to personally welcome a promising new hire into a senior management role. A request Priya found slightly unusual but not unreasonable given how deeply I remained involved in the mall's daily operations despite my age. Desmond arrived for that final meeting dressed sharply, clearly nervous but hopeful, exactly the way any man hopping to rebuild his professional confidence after 7 difficult months of unemployment should look walking into a meeting that could change his family's entire financial trajectory. He shook Priya's hand first, and then turned toward me, extending his hand with the polite, slightly distracted courtesy of a man greeting someone he assumed was simply another company executive he had not yet met. His hand froze halfway through the handshake, the moment recognition crossed his face. "Walton," he said, his voice cracking slightly, his eyes darting rapidly between me and Priya as understanding visibly crashed over him in real time. This is your building." "I own Beckett Commons, yes," I said, keeping my voice calm and even the same steady tone I had used my entire life, whether delivering good news or bad. "Priya runs daily operations. I stay involved in major hearing decisions above a certain level, which is why I'm here today." Desmond's face went through several rapid transformations: embarrassment, panic, and something that looked uncomfortably close to shame, as he clearly replayed that driveway comment about my truck in his own mind, understanding for the first time exactly whose company he had been mocking in front of his own children. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "Walton, I'm so sorry, I never meant." I raised a hand gently, cutting him off before the apology fully formed. "Your interviews were excellent, Desmond," I said. "Priya recommended you on merit alone, without any knowledge of our connection, and I've reviewed her assessment carefully. That part of this conversation has nothing to do with what happened in your driveway a few months back." I let that statement hang in the air for a long moment, watching him brace himself for what he clearly expected next, a rejection delivered as quiet, well-earned punishment for a careless comment that had cost him more than he ever imagined it could. "I'm prepared to offer you the position," I told him, watching genuine shock replace the shame on his face. "Priya's evaluation was thorough and professional, and I trust her judgment completely on matters like this. You earned this opportunity through your own qualifications, and I'm not interested in punishing genuine competence just because pride got the better of you one Sunday afternoon in a driveway." Desmond sat in stunned silence for a moment before finding his voice again. "Why?" he finally asked. "After what I said about your truck in front of everyone, in front of my own kids, you'd have every reason to walk away from this and let me keep searching somewhere else." I told him the truth, plainly, the same way I had learned to speak throughout a lifetime of hard, honest work. I explained that a man's worth never lived in the vehicle he drove or the clothes he wore, a lesson I had learned watching my own mother receive an eviction notice disguised as sympathy at my father's funeral, delivered by a man who judged our family's worth by the paper he happened to hold rather than the character we actually carried. I told him that punishing him professionally for a moment of thoughtless pride would only teach him the wrong lesson entirely, confirming exactly the kind of surface-level judgment he had shown toward me that afternoon, just aimed in the opposite direction. "But I do expect something from you before you accept this position," I continued. "Not an apology to me, an honest conversation with my daughter about why that comment came out of your mouth in the first place. 7 months of unemployment wears hard on a man's pride, Desmond. I understand that better than most people ever could. But pride that gets thrown at other people instead of faced honestly inside yourself never actually heals anything. It just spreads the hurt around instead of dealing with it. Desmond accepted the position that same day, and true to his word, he had a long, honest conversation with Callista that evening. One she later told me left both of them crying at their own kitchen table, finally addressing months of quiet resentment and fear that unemployment had buried underneath forced smiles and avoided conversations. The following months brought real change to their marriage, not because of the job title itself, but because that driveway comment and the mortifying discovery that followed it forced Desmond to finally examine exactly where his own insecurity had been coming from and exactly who it had been landing on unfairly. He became, by every account from Priya and the tenants who worked alongside him, an excellent regional operations manager, respected for the same steady competence that had earned him the position honestly in the first place. I still drive that same old truck today, rust and all, though Desmond has never once made another comment about it, not because he fears my ownership hanging over him, but because he genuinely understands now exactly what that truck represents. Decades of honest labor that built something real from absolutely nothing, $1 and one hard-earned lesson at a time. Callista told me recently that Desmond keeps a small framed photo on his office desk now, a picture of my old truck parked in front of Beckett Commons on the day it first opened, a quiet daily reminder, he told her, of exactly what humility and hard work can build when a man stops worrying about what his vehicle says about him and starts focusing on what his actual character builds instead. Thank you so much for staying with me through this story. If it made you think about your own family, about the assumptions we sometimes make based on appearances instead of character, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what stood out to you most, or share your own story if this one hit close to home. If you are new here, please subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming. Stories about family, humility, and the quiet strength that builds something real when nobody else is watching. I will see you in the next one.